Hi, this is Jennifer Stay with Coloring Bliss, and Rose and I have a question. Which one of our alcohol markers has the most ink in it? So we are going to do a little art science today and find out. What do you think, Rose? Which one will work? Let's find out. Okay, I'm gonna let Rose get down because she does not like the sound of the squeaky markers. She's not the only one. Steve doesn't like the sound of the squeaky markers either. So I'm gonna let Rose get down and explain to you how we're gonna do this test. Come here, let's get down. Yeah. Okay, I've done a similar test like this before with the ohuhu markers and the caliart markers, and this is what the test looked like. I'm going to link these two videos in the description. It's a full review of both this type of markers, but during those reviews I did this type of test to see how much ink is in these two markers. And I really liked this kind of test because it was a good comparison for me to see which one had the most ink, which is a real value indication to me on these markers. And it started me thinking which one of these markers that we can pick from when we go to the art store, which one is the best value for us. We can't really tell. When you look at the markers just at the store, there's no indication like ounces or milliliters or any indication like that about how much ink is in these markers. We just sort of have to guess. Look at the body of the marker and guess which one is going to be best for us. When you buy a bottle of ink, it always tells you how many milliliters or grams are inside that bottle of ink, but in a marker, they don't have to tell you how much ink is in there. So that's what we're going to find out today. Now, let me tell you, I am not a chemist or a scientist or any kind of accredited or official person here. So this science experiment is purely for my benefit and for your benefit. So take from it what you will. I am going to explain to you all of the different things I'm going to do to make it as fair as possible. First off, these are all brand new markers, so they've never been used by me, or hopefully by anyone else. Some of them have even been ordered straight from the company, and so they haven't even been tested like in the store by someone else. So that's the first control that we have here. The next control is that they'll all be using the same paper, which is a really good, high quality, smooth textured paper. Let me go grab a stack right now. Now, I hope this is enough of the paper. I've got plenty more if I need to get it. I have a link to this paper in the video description if you're interested in this paper. It's a nice, thick, heavy paper, but most importantly, it's a very smooth, textured paper. And that will give the ink the most advantage, the best chance to lay down as much ink as possible. So we've got good paper that we're going to use consistently from marker to marker. The next thing we're going to do is it's not necessarily about filling up the paper, it's more about how many lines of ink I can lay down. Now, this is where it's going to become more about the user, not necessarily a scientific machine laying down exactly the same amount of ink per page per stroke. So you're going to have to forgive the user and her imperfections and faults. We're going to put all the results up on a blog on my website, which is also linked below, so you can go and check it out for yourself. But I'll do basically what I did here for the ohuhus and the caliarts. I'm going to use the broad tip or the brush tip first and lay down as much as it will do until it starts to fade like it did here. And then I'll switch over to the other end if it has a second end on that particular marker and use that end for a while to give the broad tip or the brush tip a break. And then I'll switch back over to the broad tip or brush tip and lay down as much as I can, and then I'll stop. And then we'll count up all the lines and I will mark down how many broad, how many fine, and then we'll add it all up and come up with a total linear feet of ink that it was able to lay down. Now, I'm not going to go until there is absolutely no ink left in the marker. I'm going to go until there's what I would deem not enough usable ink left. You know, you come to a point with a marker where it's just frustrating and you're not going to do any more art with that marker anymore because you just can't get enough ink out to make a pretty color anymore. That's the point where I will stop with the test. Now, maybe you won't agree with my decision to do that or not. That's up to you. You can go buy a marker and do your own test if you'd like to see it tested all the way to where there's absolutely no ink left. But this is the way I'm going to test it because that's kind of a useful information for me, is for at what point would I stop using this marker? That's the point where I'm going to stop this test. So which markers are we going to test? Let me show you. Okay, so I went to the store and I've also ordered some of these offline. Now we've already tested the ohuhu marker. So this is the one that we did for ohuhu. Like I said, check out the link where you can actually see me testing this marker. And we've already tested a caliart marker. So these two brands are both about 50 cents a marker. Now I also have in here two very similar alcohol markers, a Sharpie and a Bic marker. So we'll be testing both of these. These are the only two markers that are just a single tip marker. So these will be interesting to see how much ink comes out of these two markers. Okay, also in here we have an alcohol marker by Colorit. I've got a Prismacolor Premier brush tip marker. We have a Copic ciao marker, a Copic sketch marker, a Winsor & Newton brush marker, and one of my absolute favorites, the Blick Studio brush tip marker. Okay, so what do all these markers have in common? They are all alcohol-based markers that I use for art here in my art studio, and that's why they have all been included. Comment below if there are any markers that you thought I should have included. I know there are going to be a whole bunch that you guys are going to wish I had included in this, but these are the ones that I personally use a lot, and specifically these are the alcohol based. Also, I was really tempted to include some of my water-based markers. Like for instance, I have some beautiful Tombow markers that I would love to know how long the ink lasts on these, but I decided to stick with just the alcohol-based markers. If you would be interested in me doing a separate video on the water-based markers, let me know. Comment below. Okay, so I must really love you guys because I'm going to be here for hours. In fact, maybe we'll put up a timer and let you know exactly how long I sit here and just go back and forth with these squeaky markers. I do love you guys, and this is some expensive markers, especially those Copic markers. So let us all just say goodbye to these beautiful markers and their beautiful ink. I'm going to cue the music and just sit back. I'll probably put some Netflix on so I don't go absolutely insane listening to these squeaky markers. And hopefully I don't get a little high off of the smell of the alcohol ink. All right, let's see what happens. Okay, it's day 2 of filming, and oh boy, this has been an epic undertaking, and I'm really excited to share with you all that I have learned. Look at this stack of paper and all the ink that I have laid down in 2 days worth of filming. This is an amazing amount of information that I have gained for you guys, and I can't wait to share with you all this information. And that is how much ink is inside each and every one of these markers. It is a mystery. They don't tell us how much ink they're putting into these markers. So let me switch over views and let's talk about how much ink is in all of these markers. Okay, like I said, I didn't run these markers absolutely dry. I just ran them to the point that I felt like the ink wasn't usable anymore. So let's start out by talking about Bic versus Sharpie. Now, it wouldn't be fair to compare these markers to the other markers because these markers only have one point, and it's a very fine point. So the lines on the paper went down very differently than other markers that I tested. So we're only going to compare Bic to Sharpie. So when you compare those two together, you see we got 465 lines. Let me zoom down so you can see a little bit better. You can see here we got 465 lines out of the Bic fine point woodsy brown marker versus 629 lines out of the Sharpie fine point brown. So that's quite a big difference, and let's test them here and see how they are still doing. So you can see here is the Bic. The tip itself is a little bit mushy, but not bad, and there's still some usable ink even after 465 lines. So that's good. And here is the Sharpie. It's definitely not as mushy of a point, still has a nice fine point, and there's still some usable ink. Okay, now we're going to get into some of these art quality markers here. The Copic sketch versus the Copic ciao. I was very interested about this. When you learn about these two markers on their website, they tell you that the sketch has more ink in it than the ciao. So I wanted to see if that was true. And yep, it's definitely true. The other difference is that the sketch line has more colors that you can order than the ciao line does. But they are less expensive. $5.24 a marker versus $3.59 a marker. But you do get more ink in the sketch marker versus the ciao marker. 261 usable lines of ink versus 172 usable lines of ink. So let's see how they stood the test. Let me grab each of those. Here is our sketch marker. All right, sketch. And like I said before, don't ever run your sketch marker to this point of dry because it will damage the tips. You want to refill it before it gets to this point. And here is our ciao. Still usable ink in each of these, but not a whole lot. I really used these up. Okay. Now we're going to look down here into Winsor Newton and Prismacolor Premier. These two are very similar markers as far as the way their bodies look, so I wondered if they would have a similar amount of ink. But a difference between these two is that this one has, the Winsor Newton has a chisel and brush tip, and the Prismacolor Premier has a brush and fine point. So on this one, as I tested it out on the paper, I started with the chisel and then I moved to the brush tip. Here I started with the brush tip and moved to the fine point. But look at the difference in the number of lines I was able to create. 189 usable lines of ink and 473 usable lines of ink. So a huge amount of ink in the Prismacolor Premier marker. And as far as price difference, they're very similar in price. And of course, when you purchase them in sets, their price goes way down versus when you purchase them open stock. $3.59 open stock for the Winsor & Newton, $3.69 open stock for the Prismacolor Premier. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how they are looking. Here's the Winsor Newton. This brush tip is really sad after all that abuse I put it through. And here's the Prismacolor. Okay, here are two more value lines of markers. We've got Colorit and Blick Studio. Colorit, definitely you want to purchase these in sets. When you purchase them singly, their price quadruples, $3.99 per open stock marker versus only $1 per open stock marker. That's a huge leap in cost. So over here you see the Colorit, we got 232 lines of usable ink. The chisel tip stood up to the test really well, but the fine point tip went really mushy to all that abuse. Okay, now the Blick Studio I think was one of my big surprises, especially for the value. Of course, you guys know this is one of my favorite markers. I have the full set of Blick Studio markers here in my studio. And there's almost no ink left here. There, it just was holding it wrong. Got more ink that way. Okay, the chisel tip did really well. Stood up to the abuse really good. The brush tip went quite mushy, but it did pretty good considering that we got 317 lines of ink out of it, 8 full pages of ink from this Blick Studio brush tip marker. And these come in only at $2.98 per open stock marker. And if you get them in a nice big set, they're only $2 per marker in a set. So this is why I really like the Blick Studio line. I wish they had more than just 95 colors. Hopefully someday they'll do more than just 95 colors. Okay, then down here we have 2 value markers. These are Ohuhu and Caliart. They can't be purchased open stock. You can only get them in sets, and they do have different size sets, and their prices do change. They come in on Amazon is where you have to purchase them, and the prices change quite often, so you can watch for it. This is the prices as of July 12th, 2018. So let's see how their tips stood up to all of that abuse. Let me bring my paper over here. And we'll check out Ohuhu's tips first and see how they did. Not much ink left in that Ohuhu marker. But both of the tips did really well. I'm quite surprised. They don't feel mushy, at least. They're just really empty. Okay, and that's the Caliart, and I think the Caliart tips, they did a little better than the Ohuhu, and there's still quite a bit of ink left in that Caliart marker. And if you look over here, we got significantly more lines with the Caliart, 230 lines Caliart, 192 for the Ohuhu. So a full extra page of lines when it comes to the Caliart. So that's really good. Over here, my husband and I did some math to see per page how much the ink or the markers would cost. So obviously down here, we get some of the least expensive because these are the really inexpensive line of markers. Sorry, that was out of frame, but you can see the caliart's coming in as the least expensive in this category right here between the ohuhu and caliart. Slide it down and you can see per page your best value is in the Sharpie, and I would agree with that. The Sharpie markers you get 41 colors versus I think there's only 36 colors with the Bic. I'm not positive on that, but from what I could see on their website, that's what I learned there. So I think Sharpie is probably your best value because you're getting more ink in the Sharpie marker. Now, as far as in the middle range here, let me zoom out just a bit so we can see them all. The middle range here is sort of your artist lines. If you're going to go off of just this number here, your best value is the Blick Studio markers. Now, of course, these aren't refillable and there's only 95 colors, but the cost per page of ink is really low, especially compared to like a Copic marker. Look at that, almost a third of the cost of a Copic Ciao marker. That's pretty cool. Again, this is not a scientific down to the centimeter type of test that I have just run. In fact, let's be honest, there is still ink in each and every one of these markers. Okay, so after looking over the results, Steve and I discussed it and decided that maybe we needed to do one final test to make sure that there isn't any final usable ink left over in these markers, just to make sure we're giving you really good data on these markers. So we've let the markers sit for 9 days and we're going to go ahead and do one more line test to make sure there isn't a significant amount of usable ink left over in these markers. So let's go ahead and run this test. So I just finished going through each and every marker once again. And yeah, you can see that on all these markers, there was almost no usable ink left. The Sharpie, I did get quite a few more lines, so that did verify that between the Bic and the Sharpie, once again, the Sharpie wins between these two markers. But even the lines I was getting out of the Sharpie, they are streaky and inconsistent, and I wouldn't have been using it at this point. So yeah, the Sharpie and the Bic, they were, in my terminology, not usable. But if you look at the Copic, both of them, the Ciao and the Sketch, I wouldn't call these usable. The Winsor and Newton, I didn't get very many, maybe one good usable line out of that marker. Now the one that did get some usable ink out of it was, again, that Prismacolor marker, which is the surprising marker out of the whole test. So way to go, Prismacolor. Look at all of those usable lines that we got after letting that marker sit for over a week. Still, not a lot of usable ink, but we did get some more usable ink out of that marker. Let me show you the other ones. Here is what we found leftover ink in the Colorit. Maybe 2 or 3 usable lines of ink left over in that one. The Blick, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of usable ink left over there. Ohuhu, I really used that one up. There was nothing left in that marker. And maybe 2 or 3 lines of usable ink left over in the caliart. So yep, I did a good job, and letting those markers sit did extend the life a tiny bit of that ink, but not very much. If I really wanted to prolong the life of these markers, there are things I could do. So let's talk about that. If you want to prolong the life of your markers, what do? You store them horizontally, especially if they have double-ended. If they're a single-ended marker like these Sharpies and Bic markers, you can store them tip down. Basically what that does is keeps the ink down towards the tip end. But other markers like these double-ended Winsor & Newton Newton brush markers, you want to store horizontally. That keeps the ink evenly distributed between the two ends. So that's one thing you can do, store your markers properly. The next thing you can do is give your markers breaks. I didn't do that for this test. I wanted to keep it consistent from marker to marker, so there were no breaks given to these markers. I just kept laying the ink down, and the other thing I did consistently was I always started with the broadest end of the marker. So if there's a chisel tip, I started with the chisel tip. If the broadest end was a brush tip, like again with this Winsor Newton marker, then I started with the brush tip. And then the only break that these markers got was when I switched to the other or more narrow end, and then I would work with that end for a little while, and then I would switch back over to the broader end again and keep laying ink down. And then I would stop when I would get to a point where it was, not very usable ink anymore. But like I said, there is still ink left over in these markers, so I could have kept going if I wanted to. But where I stopped was where I felt like I would have been frustrated, and I would have stopped as an artist and stopped using this marker, and it would have gone to a stack. I have a stack of markers that I keep of almost empty markers, and I go to them or hand them out when my kids need a marker just to kind of abuse that marker. That's those markers that I go and grab and hand to them. So that's when I stopped for each of these markers. So that's how you can take care of your markers. Now, another thing you want to make sure of that you want to remember is if you're using a marker that is refillable, like the Copic markers, if you have invested in Copic Sketch or Copic Ciao markers, don't ever use your markers to this point where they're this dry. That will ruin the tips of your markers. Don't do that. You want to, if it starts feeling a little dry, that's when you stop and refill your markers. Keep those tips nice and juicy, and that protects those tips and prolongs the life of the nibs. So remember that with refillable markers, keep them juicy, protects the nibs of those markers. Okay, so that pretty much covers how to prolong the life of your markers. Now, the next thing that everybody's going to ask is, okay, so yeah, we've talked about which markers last the longest, but which markers are the best, Jennifer? Which ones blend the best? Pretty much all alcohol markers, the ink is going to fade on you. No alcohol markers are archival. They all fade. Blendability and performance for me comes down to which markers have the best nibs. I really love a brush tip marker. Those are my favorite because those brush tips, they blend better for me than, say, a fine point tip like a Sharpie tip marker. The ink is fine for me, although it's really stinky, but the ink will work fine for me, but it's that tiny little tip is so hard to work with. So I like a marker with a nice brush tip because I can get strokes that I can work with. The other difference is the paper you use. If you're using just standard copy paper or just a really inexpensive coloring book, you're not going to be able to get good deep blends, good strokes. All those things are going to be really frustrating, not to mention the fact that it's going to bleed through really easily. If you're using a good high quality cardstock that is really smooth, then almost any alcohol ink is going to perform really nice for you. Especially if you have colors that are close to each other, like a good light, medium, and dark tone, then you can get beautiful blends. It doesn't matter whether you're working with a Sharpie or a Copic marker, you're going to get good blends. So I'm going to put a link in the video description to the kind of paper that I prefer to work with, so check that out. Also, I'm going to put a link to my Sharpie coloring series where I show you that I can get good blends even with a Sharpie marker. So now I do prefer a marker with a good brush tip like these Blick Studio markers here. Even the brush tips on like the Prismacolor markers, those are beautiful and work great, and you can get good blends, and it just makes your life easier to have a good brush tip on your marker. Okay, so now that we've got performance and blendability behind us, the next aspect, of course, when it comes to alcohol markers is cost and availability. Whether you live in the United States or Canada or in Europe, it's going to really determine what kind of marker is available to you and the cost, of course. So that's the next thing that you're going to look at when you're picking out your markers. Here in the United States, we have a ton of choices. We can go into things like the caliart markers, which come in way under 50 cents a marker now. They're, let's see, today, as of July 12th, 2018, you can buy a 100 set of these caliart markers for just $47. That's amazing. To buy 100 copic markers, we're talking, let's see, those are like $5.24 each. So that would be $524 to buy 100 copic markers. Of course, with the caliart markers, you get different kinds of nibs and you can't buy them open stock. So those are some other things you want to consider. Can you buy your markers open stock? That means one at a time. So you want to consider that. Check out my caliart marker review where I go in and discuss things like that. I also have a marker video where I discuss the differences between a copic marker and a marker like a caliart and why you might choose one over the other. That's a good video where you can look at those kinds of decisions and help you determine whether you want to invest in a copic type marker. Now, another thing you want to think about is the variety of colors. So for instance, if you were going to decide between purchasing the set of copic sketch markers versus the set of copic ciao markers, there are 358 different colors you can pick from with the copic sketch and only 180 colors for the copic ciaos. But if you start looking into things like the Prismacolor Premier markers versus the Winsor Newton brush markers, then your color choices go down even more. Winsor Newton, I think, only have 68 colors, but Prismacolor Premier, they have 200 colors. The Blick Studio markers that I'm really fond of, they only have 95 colors. So you want to consider that as well. If you're just a colorist and you just want some beautiful alcohol markers to color in a coloring book, having 358 colors might not be important to you. But if you're a fine artist or a comic book artist and you need that depth of color, lots of variation in color, then you're going to want to have the potential of tons of different colors to pick from. So that will be important to you. Now there's other features that you're going to want to know about. For instance, can you replace the nibs on a marker? So maybe you have a very favorite marker like this one, 017 teal green, and maybe something happens to the nib, like it gets crushed or your dog gets to it or something. Can you replace that nib, or are you going to have to replace the full marker? Some brands you can replace just the nib, like the Copics. This Blick Studio line, you can't replace just the nib, so I would have to replace the full marker. So that's one thing to consider as well. Another thing is the refillable inks, like the Copic markers have an entire line of refillable inks. So that's really cool, especially if you're using up ink really quickly. But again, if you're just a colorist and you just want a set of markers and you don't go through the ink really, really fast, then maybe that's not as important to you. Another thing to consider is that some of these lines come with really nice cases when you purchase their markers. Like the Colorit line, they come with a really nice case. So when you purchase your set of 50, it comes with a really nice case. So that's another thing to consider. Also, Prismacolor, these ones here, they also come in really nice cases. Sometimes when you purchase a set with a case, it ups the cost really high. Sometimes it doesn't, and it's just a gimmick that the company is doing. They want you to buy their markers, and so they're presenting it in a beautiful case to get you to purchase their markers. So take that into consideration. It does become very complicated very fast, but it can be worth your time to really do some research and find just the right marker for you. Okay, so that's the end of this epic marker ink test. Now, I know a lot of you probably would have done this test a little bit differently from me. I also know that some of this kind of testing has been done on other channels. Like Baylee Jae has done a similar test, and I know that SuperRaeDizzle has done a similar test. But this is the way I wanted to do the test, where it's done by the line of ink rather than just filling up a full page. I wanted to see by the line of ink. And I must say I was quite surprised to learn that it came between the Prismacolor Premier and the Blick Studio Marker, that these two seem to have the most ink in them. That's pretty cool to learn that. I really thought that the Copic sketch marker would have been right up there with these other markers. But nope, these two seem to have the most ink in them. So I'm excited to have learned that. So I hope you found that interesting. Were you surprised by the results? Now, speaking of the results, I'm going to take photos of all of my results and I'm going to post them, including links to all these markers that I tested, in a blog over on my website. So follow that link over to my blog so that you can learn and study all the results for yourself. And like I said, make sure you comment below. I would like to know, do you approve of this test? Do you think I did this art science correctly? Would you have done it differently? Let me know. I'm really curious. And which one of these markers would you choose if you were able to choose any of them? Would you choose the Sharpie over the Bic? Would you choose Blick Studio over a Copic Ciao? Let me know. I'd love to know. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I had so much fun doing it, although it was a lot of work. And I don't think I want to smell an alcohol marker for a while. I think I need a break from the alcohol markers. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful, blissful day. Bye-bye, everybody. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Stay. You're supposed to sit on your pillow. Come here. Right here. Okay. Go have a drink. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Stay. Okay, sit down now. Sit down. Good girl. Look at Mama. Right here. Look at Mama. Oh. Hi, this is Jennifer Stay with Coloring Bliss, and this is Sweet Rose, and we have a question for you. Which one of our alcohol markers has the most alcohol ink in it? What do you think, Rose? Which one?